Now that they've gone with Waltz, where do you think Jewish voters will be? Will they stick with the Democrats?
But a lot of American Jews have experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. They've experienced a normalization of hate, and top Democrats are okay with this. Biden made it pretty clear he wants the war to end, Israel to cut a deal with Hamas. This is sending a message to Iran that it can attack Israel freely and that it has nothing to worry about.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week, we have an interesting conversation for you about the ongoing crisis in the Middle East and American politics with columnist and author Daniel Greenfield. But before we begin, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Should American Jews be disappointed or relieved that Vice President Kamala Harris didn't tap Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as her running mate? Had she chosen him to be the Democrats' vice presidential nominee, it would have been a source of pride for a community that has been deeply shaken by the events of the last 10 months since October 7th and the subsequent surge in American anti-Semitism. But the push against Shapiro from the increasingly influential, intersectional, and anti-Israel left wing of the Democratic Party, specifically because he was Jewish and willing to call out anti-Semitic pro-Hamas demonstrators on college campuses, has exposed the ugly face of contemporary American political discourse. But had he been picked by Harris, a figure who, like former President Barack Obama, is clearly less inclined to support Israel than even the increasingly shaky Biden, Shapiro's only function on the ticket and in the administration, should they have won, might have been to serve as the beard, to cover for hostility to the Jewish state and efforts to defend itself against terrorists. Moreover, the process by which Shapiro was forced to back away from his youthful criticisms of the Palestinians on the Oslo Accords, stands which were not only justified at the time, but proven correct by subsequent events, and to move closer to the Democrats' anti-Semitic left wing, was not just a humiliation for him, but for all pro-Israel Democrats and American Jews. We don't know how this will play out in the long run, as Harris and Trump battle it out until November, but for the first time ever, perhaps, Jews in Israel can be said to be a serious issue in a presidential campaign. That not only signals the final death rattle of the largely mythical bipartisan pro-Israel consensus, but the fact that the satirical Babylon Bee website proved prophetic when they mockingly wondered a couple of days ago whether choosing a Jew for vice president would cost the Democrats the all-important Death to America vote in Michigan should worry everyone. At a time when Israel is under attack and the Biden-Harris administration continues to be angrier at Israeli self-defense and killings of terrorists than they are at the terrorist funders in Iran, the latest twists in American politics can be said to be discouraging. These are dangerous times for Americans and Jews, and the efforts of the anti-Semitic left should worry us. But they shouldn't cause us to lose sight of the fact that most Americans remain pro-Israel, and there are more votes to be lost in the center by catering to anti-Semites than on the far left by being too pro-Israel. To discuss all this with us, we are pleased to have one of the strongest voices calling out left-wing radical anti-Semites in journalism today. Daniel Greenfield is the Shillman Journalism Fellow and Executive Vice President of Programs at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is a columnist whose work is widely published, Front Page Magazine, and at JNS. He's also the author of a new book, Domestic Enemies, The Fight Against the Left. Daniel Greenfield, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you so much.
Well, Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the big news of the day, which is Kamala Harris passing over Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro for the vice presidential nomination. By the time this podcast airs, which will be 2 days from now, I think we'll both have published columns about it. But I'm sure you'll have plenty to say about it as well. But what do you think, just as we speak off the top of our heads on one foot? What do you think it says about the Democratic Party in 2024 and Kamala Harris? And do you think it hurts her? Or I guess if this is a base election and if she needs the hard left and anti-Semites, or as the Babylon Bee said, the hate America vote more than Pennsylvania and wants unity at the Democrats' Chicago convention later this month, was it a smart move?
Bottom line is a VP pick is often about unifying the party, be somebody you don't have into it. And Kamala had two ways she could go. She could have gone to the center. She could have gone with a more moderate figure, which is why so many Democrats were actually promoting and suggesting Governor Josh Shapiro. He represented a more moderate position, not only on Israel, but on a variety of other issues like school choice. He was able to actually talk to Republicans. After the Trump assassination, it was impressive to a lot of Republicans how he could actually show respect. Tim Walz represents the exact opposite. This was the guy who was being advanced by Bernie Sanders, by the left. He emerged really as the leftist candidate. Even though his own track record has not necessarily been that far to the left, he was being advanced by the left. So basically there was a choice between a unity deal with the left, a unity deal with centrist Democrats, and Kamala picked a unity deal with the left. Now, for a little bit of context here, back in 2020, when Biden secured the nomination, or secured the nomination most of the way, Barack Obama came in and brokered a unity deal. The unity deal would position a lot of Obama, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren veterans in the administration, but the vice presidency itself was off the table. The vice presidency went to secure Biden's support from black voters. Now, seemingly, the Kamala campaign believes it does not need the support of black voters, so it's taking them for granted. It's presuming that because Kamala is black or identifies as black or is partly black, she already has their support locked in. So she was focused now on securing the support of the left. And that means really that the ticket, the Kamala Walz ticket, really discounts moderate, centrists, independents, a lot of the American political spectrum in order to secure this alliance with the left. So it's unhealthy from an electoral standpoint. It's also unhealthy from a political standpoint because it means the Democrats are going further to the left rather than trying to aspire to the center.
Yeah, I think it is telling that this was a pick that sort of the squad is very happy about. Even if Tim Walz really isn't, as far to the left as they are, or even close to that, he was certainly preferable to them more, than Shapiro. Although ironically, and this is, something people who know Pennsylvania politics, the biggest supporter of Israel in the Democratic Party right now is John Fetterman, and John Fetterman hates Josh Shapiro, and there's talk that he helped scupper this because he sort of dropped a dime on Shapiro and told Kamala he's a self-promoting, egomaniac, and she's not going to like being in business with him. But we'll see how that works out. Shifting a little bit to the question of Jews and how they regarded this, I think in the aftermath of October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in this country, there was some talk that Jewish voters, Democrats, most of whom are Democrats, were now going to be considering voting for the Republicans because of the way the sort of anti-Semitic left has turned against Israel, turned against Jews. Certainly picking Shapiro would have, I think, really put an end to a lot of that discussion. But now that they've gone with Walz, where do you think Jewish voters will be? Will they stick with the Democrats, as some of us think, or, and as they did in 2020, or is there going to be some kind of a shift?
Well, one of the proxy battles between Shapiro and Walz was this perception: is the Democratic Party going to reach out more to Jewish voters or to Muslim voters who were a significant presence in Minnesota and who Governor Walz has been tied up with? And again, clearly they chose the Islamic side of that spectrum. Now, as to what Jews are going to do is difficult to say. There's been one recent poll that seemingly suggested that there was a kind of 40-50 split between Trump and Kamala now on the Jewish vote. It's hard to say, in part because there's really no such thing as reliable independent polling of Jewish voters. And this is a major problem because we get all these claims that 70% of Jews voted for Biden, 80% of Jews voted for Obama. None of these statistics are reliable. There are basically two ways of producing these polls. One is it's coming from leftist Jewish organizations, some directly entangled with Jewish Democrats in the Democratic Party, that are built on creating this perception. There's very, very limited exit polling data. The one state that we actually have any meaningful Jewish polling data from that is independent is the Siena College poll of Jewish voters. That's limited to New York, but New York does contain a lot of the Jewish population in the United States. And the Siena College polls generally tend to show a kind of 50-40, 65-35 split between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to Republican Democrat presidential candidates. So the split has never been that extreme, and I think the numbers are generally showing that there is a significant amount of Jewish support for Trump, or at least Jewish unhappiness with the Democratic Party. When you talk to Jewish Democrats or Democrats in private, they will say that they know they have a problem with Jewish voters and with Jewish donors. They're just not willing to actually fundamentally shift course to do anything about it. They've adopted the Obama policy of basically blaming the problems in the relationship on Netanyahu. Thus, when Netanyahu came, he delivered a tremendous speech. It was a bipartisan speech that made a point of thanking both Biden and Trump. And Democrats in their media already had the script running, which they actually discard this as a partisan speech, as an attack, as very ungrateful. So this effort has, persuaded some Jewish liberals to think that, it's Netanyahu. If there was another government in Israel, this would not be an issue. But a lot of American Jews have experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. They've experienced a normalization of hate. They've experienced a situation where you have people who are waving Hamas flags on campuses, terrorizing Jews, and top Democrats are okay with this. They defend this. They describe this as peaceful. Local Democrats, such as the LA city government, sanctioned this. So they are seeing this. They're not blind to it. They're seeing what's going on social media, and they're not happy with the response from top Democrats.
Yeah, well, I think when you reference that, to me, Kamala Harris has now done this 3 times, but most recently where she expressed her understanding of sort of the anti-Semitic pro-Hamas demonstrators on campuses, saying that they are seen and heard, and she repeated it even in her rather scathing comments about Israel and Netanyahu after meeting with him the day after his speech, which she boycotted. And in essence, as I've said this before, I've written it, Kamala Harris did exactly what the left falsely accused Trump of doing at Charlottesville in 2017 when they claimed that he said that the neo-Nazis were very fine people, that he actually didn't say that. But what Kamala is basically saying is that she thinks the pro-Hamas demonstrators, those anti-Semites, are very fine people. And the fact that Shapiro, whatever you think of him, whatever you think his role would have been on the ticket or in a Democratic administration, he was forced to sort of undress and sort of walk back some of his pro-Israel past. I think certainly, and the fact that it's certainly within the left and in places like Slate and The Nation, there was and other sort of left-wing publications, there was a real campaign against him. And while it's not clear to me that this will have any resonance of a long run in our political discourse, it still is quite a thing for Jews to digest, to see what happened in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, the spectacle of Governor Shapiro having to come out and disavow his support for Israel, apologize for it. There's no way that Governor Walz or anybody else would have had to disavow their support for BLM, their support for the Hamas.
Perhaps they should.
They should, but there's been no such pressure, nor would there be any, nor would we see a scene like that. The fact that a Jewish governor has to do this is a sign of how bad the Democratic Party has become.
Well, I think it's impossible to discuss the 2024 campaign and what happened to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris taking over after the coup that forced him out without talking about the way the corporate mainstream legacy liberal media has essentially dropped even the slightest pretense that they are interested in reporting rather than being partisan advocates, regardless of whether or not they have the power to alter the outcome of the election, because we are now so bifurcated and half the country really doesn't care what the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and MSNBC say about anything because they're just not reading, watching, or listening to them. How does the American Republic survive with a press corps that has basically become a mouthpiece with a liberal regime, covering up for Biden, then exposing Biden when it became, bad for the Democrats, and now just being all in on Kamala-Mania, even though she hasn't given a single interview since she was picked?
Now, there was this perception in the past cultivated by the media that the purpose of the news media was to kind of inform Americans, to report on news. The media has since evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective, into a partisan arm of the Democrats, beyond that of the left in general, that is entirely dedicated. All of its messaging is dedicated to achieving political goals of the left, to helping Democrats where those goals coincide with the goals of the left. So the public has responded accordingly. You look at the actual trust polling in the media, it is below anybody. It's pretty much there at the bottom. The actual existence of trust in the media is pretty much non-existent. The problem is that because of the status of major corporations and the legacy media, they have a good deal of a footprint. They have a sizable presence beyond anything that is justified by their actual audiences. Now, the question is, how long is this going to last? Take CNN, for example, which is now the vestige kind of toenail in the Discovery corporate behemoth. And Discovery keeps trying to cut costs, and it's trying to figure out how to prevent CNN from losing money. The Paramount deal potentially will shed CBS News, which has been the Tiffany Network. It's the great, the Walter Cronkite, all that stuff.
Meant a great deal 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yes, it did. Now it's just this kind of uncomfortable money-losing venture, and that's the same. The same is really true for a lot of the news networks. The networks themselves are on the verge of disappearing, and we're on the verge of switching to this entirely streaming infrastructure where people pick and choose what channels they're looking for and whose news they're going to watch. But the flip side is that the media is increasingly transitioning to a nonprofit project or to one maintained by billionaires like Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, the former CEO of Amazon, who are looking to buy influence and maintain influence by control of the media. So the idea of this media as a kind of establishment voice is disappearing just because the business model is collapsing. In 10 years, I think we'll see very few remnants of this. But the media is going to transition to a publicly funded, in some cases. There's a big push to create a nonprofit media, and a funded by a handful of billionaires who are looking to maintain influence by controlling legacy media outlets. But the idea that the public really takes a lot of the media seriously is vanishing, which is why I think the campaign to try to turn Kamala into the next Obama is going to fail, because the reality is when the media really pivoted and created a cult of personality around Obama, this was a systemic shock. It can't be repeated again. What they're doing for Kamala is very exciting to people who are on the left, who are liberals, but it's really not capturing most of the country.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that Obama, for all of his faults, and neither of us were, to put it mildly, fans of his, Obama was a brilliant politician and a very good speaker. He was a leader. Kamala is not Obama, and all the the fact that everybody on CNN and MSNBC and writing for the New York Times, even the pretend conservatives there, are all on board with Kamala-Mania doesn't actually make it so. I mean, but I guess we'll find out in 3 months, what impact that has. But doing that doesn't, the fact that they say so doesn't make it. You reference Cronkite. People spoke, perhaps, exaggerating his influence, but like when Lyndon Johnson lost Cronkite, he lost, America lost the Vietnam War. I don't think anybody in the media has that kind of power on the left or on the right. Which kind of leads me to my next question, which is, obviously it's been a really crazy summer with all that happened with Biden and then Harris, the attempted assassination of Trump, and as I said, Kamala-Mania on the part of the lockstep liberal press. But we've still got 90 days left until this election. And I guess my question is, what do you envision happening in the next 90 days as we head towards Armageddon in November? You wrote the day before we're speaking about Democrats planning to try their own insurrection to stop Trump from being inaugurated if he wins, which is something I've written about myself in The Federalist. What do you envision happening in the next 90 days and the 2 months after this election, and how much crazier do you think this election year can get?
I think there's no predicting at this point what's going to happen from week to week. One thing I think we should look out for is the resumption of Black Lives Matter riots. We've seen signals that there's a relaunch of the BLM messaging, and we're now seeing a lot of stories about 2 recent deaths that are BLM adjacent. So I think certainly they want to reserve that option, especially with a semi-Black candidate on the ticket. They may be looking at a scenario where they actually think they can benefit from race riots. In the past, BLM riots have been positioned to election years. It would not hugely surprise me if we're going to see race riots before the election. The only calculus would be, is it going to help Kamala or is it going to hurt Kamala? Beyond that, I think they're going to try every possible trick. And what you're referring to is Representative Jamie Raskin coming out and saying that some House Democrats would band together and try to prevent accepting Trump, even if he actually does win the election, because they're going to argue that he's disqualified because of an insurrection. I don't think this is going to work, but it's notable, especially in light of the fact that Democrats have run this campaign to criminalize election challenges, to criminalize rejecting elections, what they call election denial, is that they've challenged every single Republican presidential candidate who won in the century. Bush twice, Trump once. It would be absolutely no surprise to me that they will actually try to challenge Trump. And that might be one of the reasons they're also going after the Supreme Court. If they actually were able to reshape the Supreme Court, then suddenly they would actually have the ability potentially to block Trump at the Supreme Court level. Again, I don't think there's any possible way this could happen. But the fact that they're thinking along those lines says just how extreme and how out of the box their planning is, and tells us we're in for a very wild ride.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty much a given there will be riots if Trump wins. I think, most major cities, storekeepers had their windows boarded up, in November 2020. That should certainly be the case this year. And, if Trump, manages to win, that's what we could look forward to. You mentioned the Democrats' sort of attack on the Supreme Court and what Biden, announced last week in a Washington Post op-ed. I think we can't let this go without noting that the same people who are cheering the possibility, obviously, what Biden spoke of will require constitutional amendments and not just things passed by Congress. So it's not going to happen, or at least certainly not going to happen in the foreseeable future. But the same people in this country, especially among members of the liberal Democrats and especially liberal Jewish Democrats, think this is just fine. But they were also the ones claiming that attempts to reform the much more powerful, much more out of control Israeli Supreme Court, that was anti-democracy. And yet they want to cut back on the power of the much less powerful U.S. Supreme Court. Ironies about, I guess, chutzpah in politics is unlimited, but I think it bears mentioning that the hypocrisy here is just staggering.
Yeah, well, their definition of democracy is obviously not the will of the people, because in Israel, precisely, they were arguing that the Supreme Court that should have total power against the representatives of the people, against the Knesset, against the Prime Minister, that the Supreme Court, that these unelected, establishment types should be able to override any Knesset decision purely because of their whim. That's the exact opposite of democracy. And likewise here, Kamala is a candidate whom nobody voted for. But democracy, you have to understand, is social democracy, not actually the democratic will of the people. It's not the people who vote. Rather, it's basically identical with the left. So social democracy means that the left is upholding democracy by upholding its own power, even when it's against the will and the power of the people.
Yeah, if the Democrats don't win in this country, Democrats don't think it's democratic, which is actually a line from an old Broadway musical. But let's take a step back now from the U.S. election for a minute and look at events in the Middle East. Right now, the Biden-Harris administration has been expressing frustration at Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the killings of prominent Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists responsible for rivers of Jewish blood because it has angered Iran and made Washington looked weak and supposedly made it harder for them to force Israel to sign a ceasefire deal that would have bailed out Hamas. What do you think the real objectives of U.S. Middle East policy are right now? And, with Israelis waiting, for, supposed Iran retaliation for the death of Hamas figure in Tehran. And if Harris wins in November, what do you think it will look like for Israel in 2025?
So there's a domestic objective and there's an international policy objective. The domestic is a political objective. Biden made it pretty clear he wants the war to end, Israel to cut a deal with Hamas by the time the convention is there. They want to be able to brag that they brought peace in the Middle East. We know how great Democrats are bringing peace to the Middle East. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama have great achievements in that regard. But they also obviously want to appease the Hamas supporters, the people who are going to show up at the convention and outside it and protest and wave their red triangles and their Hamas flags, and all this is bad optics. But internationally, it's really the same policy agenda that began under Obama, which is rolling back American strength, empowering Iran and creating some sort of new paradigm in the Middle East. They set the Middle East on fire when they did this during Obama. The Biden administration has been not as successful in setting the Middle East on fire, but they've been trying very hard. And their message has been that the issue is escalation and that they're going to de-escalate. Rather than focusing on what Netanyahu expressed in the speech, which is a desire to win, they're going to focus on de-escalating, which means, Israel has to accept a certain amount of damage, a certain amount of Hamas terrorism in exchange for not escalating the conflict further. And this has really been a paradigm that Qatar and Iran helped develop and that they're now implementing. And when the Biden administration comes along and tells Netanyahu that the only way that they're going to intercept rockets from Iran that are aimed at Israel is if Israel agrees not to significantly retaliate against Iran, which is what they did the last time around. This is sending a message to Iran that it can attack Israel freely and that it has nothing to worry about, which actually ends up creating escalation. But the usual methods for de-escalating conflicts, for bringing peace, actually just do the opposite. They create war. They escalate the conflict, but the Biden team are the same people as the Obama team. And so they're really driven by this idea that Iran has legitimate grievances, which is something the Obama team believed, and that only by de-escalating the conflict and reaching some sort of deal are we going to end the violence, when in fact that is the exact way to feed the violence. And as a result of Obama's foreign policy, Iran was able to get a deep foothold in both Iraq and in Syria. They expanded their already death grip over Lebanon, and now they're digging deep into Yemen and directly engaging in a war with Israel.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of denial at the heart. I mean, I think back in the 90s when, Clinton and his peace processes in the State Department were promoting the Oslo Accords, the denial about Palestinian intentions was obvious, but it's even more obvious now. Hamas showed us what they believed in on October 7th, which is the destruction of Israel and genocide. That's what Iran believes in. And yet, Biden, Harris, and basically all the Obama admin alumni that work for them seem to think that doesn't really matter. And they still speak of a political solution, and they oppose Israel winning in this war or trying to win because they don't believe that Israel should win or don't believe in the possibility of Israel winning the war. And yet they don't acknowledge what it is that the other side wants to do in the war, and which is to win and which is to destroy Israel. And I think that colors not only their policy, but the way their echo chamber in the liberal mainstream press, which we've already discussed, reports about this. We have things like the CNN doing this whole report about how Israel is losing the war in Gaza, and it's impossible to watch that or read the online version of it without thinking, well, that's your editorial position. Is it actually backed up by the evidence? How can we trust this? How can we trust the administration when it doesn't seem to acknowledge basic facts about the conflict?
In the 80s and 90s, Democrats came into this idea that fighting wars was absolutely hopeless, that you could not actually win anything by fighting a war unless it's under the sponsorship of the United Nations, and diplomacy is the way forward. When they tried to move this forward with the Oslo Accords, they ran into a major problem, which is that the PLO side, the terrorist side, absolutely refused to do anything beyond making pro forma statements, signing agreements, but actually refusing to implement peace and, in fact, began pursuing war. Once the Clinton administration very clearly understood that they were never going to get any kind of peace buy-in from the PLO, they decided to blame the side that is tractable rather than the side that is intractable. Because if they actually blamed and were honest about it on a consistent basis, Bill Clinton occasionally made statements, but if they were consistently honest about the fact that the PLO, that the Islamic terrorists did not want peace, were not going to have peace, they would have to admit that their whole policy was a miserable failure. But for them, it became safe to blame Israel, to blame the side that was supposed to be more powerful, and to demand concessions from Israel because they could actually get concessions from Israel, whereas they could never get any concessions from the terrorist side. And this has become the dynamic now for decades. There hasn't even been a serious discussion about peace in quite a while. Even during the Obama-Kerry years, it wasn't even really about peace. It increasingly became about de-escalating a conflict with Hamas. It became creating these hudnas, these ceasefires with Hamas, which is exactly how we got to October 7th. And in the wake of October 7th, after a brief upsurge of support, the same failed conceptia has reestablished itself again, which is that we need to get to a point where Israel and Hamas agree to a ceasefire, and we have these metrics, we have these rewards for Hamas in order to maintain this ceasefire. Now, Hamas used those 2 years in which it was getting rewards, in which it was getting incentives to maintain quiet, to build up its way to the October 7th attacks. And nobody has decided to learn anything at all from that. Instead, they've decided that, much like communism, their plan for a ceasefire just wasn't tried the right way.
Yeah, I think that's true. Let me just ask one more question about Middle East and also related to the election. We're used to hearing people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden speak of their support for Israel and then acting as if they don't really mean it. They support Israel's right to self-defense. They just don't think that Israel should exercise that right. Should he win, Trump has a very solid pro-Israel record. But, there are some voices who worry that a second Trump administration wouldn't be as pro-Israel as the first, whether it was because of different people in positions of power, or as some, argue, the influence of someone like Tucker Carlson, who was obviously part of the Trump family's inner circle and no friend to Israel. Do you think there's any reason to worry that Trump will not be as good for Israel as he was during his first term if he wins?
Well, Tucker Carlson is obviously bad news insofar as he's made some dubious arrangements and statements with people on the more Muslim side of the spectrum that hasn't really been discussed or disclosed. And there are people obviously potentially in Trump's circle like Douglas McGregor who would very much be an object of concern. That said, however, Trump is naturally himself innately far more pro-Israel. And much like with Reagan, there were people around Reagan who were obviously anti-Israel, who were bad for Israel. And there were people around George W. Bush who were the same thing. But both men were basically pro-Israel, and so we had more pro-Israel administrations. Obviously, in the Bush administration, we had a very anti-Israel Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. That will hopefully not happen again because it's important to remember that personnel is policy. Presidents only pay attention to so many things. They set out priorities. They then bring in people who are tasked with actually implementing those priorities. So if we have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for example, I don't think we have anything to worry about. So it's important to make sure that the right personnel are there, that the right people are there in the driver's seat. And with Trump, that is, we have far more reason to be hopeful about that than we do with Kamala, where we have a pretty clear expectation that there are some very bad people around her, people like her current National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon, her Middle East advisor, Juan Goldenberg, both of whom are big supporters of pandering to Hamas.
I think that's a very important point. I want to turn now to your new book, Domestic Enemies, which is a very interesting deep dive into the history of the first 90 years of the American Republic and the role that the far left played in that era. Why write such a book now, and what did you learn in the course of doing the research and writing of it do you think would come as a surprise to most Americans?
Well, back when I was writing it, it was 2020. For some people, this seemed like an unprecedented historical period, one that we couldn't believe that we were living through. And I started actually chapter 1 with describing a pandemic that forced the evacuation of the nation's capital back in Philadelphia by George Washington, key figures among the founding fathers, and the resulting election challenges, which ended up later throwing the entire election into Congress, and the general state of chaos and catastrophe that seemed to reign back then. My overall point is that we're not living through a new history, we're living through a continuation of history. And for a lot of people, there is this sense that we are in unprecedented times. These are catastrophes that could not have been dealt with in the past. So my purpose was to, yes, show that the Founding Fathers had come up against it, that really throughout American history. The book actually concludes with the Civil War. We're up against the struggle between moderates, between conservatives, between centrists, and the far left that was determined to implement what the French Revolution had brought into being with its vision, which was what we today call equity, enforced government equality. And actually go through various periods and a lot of forgotten history that show the struggle over time. And it's important for us to remember not only that we have dealt with this before, we survived it before, but that the left really has no new ideas. All these ideas really amount to the same things that the French Revolution was promoting, which is forcibly give government enough power and you can actually create this perfect society. In reality, it backfires. It results in violence, in misery, and poverty. And it's done that over and over again for 2 centuries.
Now, among the many interesting nuggets in your book, and specifically about the early years of the Republic, you refer to Aaron Burr as the man who might have been our first community organizer president. A whole generation of young people are now aware of Burr and Alexander Hamilton because of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton. How skewed do you think their understanding of the Founding Fathers is because of that being their only source? And how do you think that's influenced public discourse and our view of history leading up to, and certainly when you started writing this was in the aftermath of the 1619 Project, which has, so influenced, unfortunately, and for the worse, our understanding of American history.
Aaron Burr is an absolutely brilliant figure. He's arguably quite incredibly evil. After he leaves office at one point, he's bargaining with both the British and the French to figure out a way to split up the United States and allow them to take over. He is the vice president of the United States. He aspires to become the president. He really ushers in the modern system of elections. The 1800 presidential election is fought on entirely new terrain. He builds his own version of a big data operation. He goes out, he does immigrant outreach. He makes sure that his people are there counting the votes. He has this big vision. He wants to be president. He has to settle for being vice president. And really, he creates the modern urban political machine, the one that the Democratic Party has been using for 2 centuries. So he's a visionary figure, but kind of, unfortunately, at least for him, he becomes a footnote in Alexander Hamilton's history, becomes known as the man who kills Alexander Hamilton, but he only kills Alexander Hamilton when he's been thoroughly disgraced, when all his various plans have come to naught, and then he decides to wreak revenge. He decides to actually confront Alexander Hamilton, which is in many ways a poor decision for both men, but it really does not capture the impact that Aaron Burr has on American history, which is a huge one. And part of why I wrote this book is to actually understand where it is that the things we're dealing with have come from.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. The French Revolution sort of is the origin of sort of the neo-Marxist discourse of our era and of all the horrors of the 20th century. And that played out in the United States. And certainly you also reference the various millenarian movements, communist, sort of communal, experiments that took place in the 1840s and during the early part of American history that are largely forgotten now. The people only think of these things of happening in the 60s, but, it happened back then too. And it was not, disconnected from politics, was it?
No, absolutely not. All the things that we're dealing with were being dealt with. Ein chadash takas Hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. So my second chapter actually deals with how a inflationary government in Rhode Island that was just trying to redistribute wealth by printing money did their best to stop the Constitution. Rhode Island becomes the only state that is now represented at the Constitutional Convention. And I delve into the origins. Yes, the people who were called communists originally were those who wanted to have these communal little setups where there was no private property, there would be no marriage, and they would create their ideal society. But beyond that, it's the role of the Democratic Party in ultimately advancing these various leftist causes. Once the Democratic Party actually comes on the scene, it becomes the engine for the transformation of America because the left gets increasingly more powerful and develops more of a role in the Democratic Party. And one of the things I actually delve into is the term Democrat actually came out of the French Revolution, at least in American political discourse, because the French Revolution sent its various agents to the United States to try to drum up support and gain influence against the Washington administration and the Adams administration. And they set up little societies that they call democratic societies. Aaron Burr is a member. Others on the left are members. And these democratic societies then give their name to the Democratic Republican Party. The Republican Party is more moderate. The Democrat Party is more radical. And the Democratic Republican Party eventually sheds the Republican Party of its name. It simply becomes the Democratic Party. And that party is dedicated to this idea of dismantling all various institutions. So that's something we see going forward into the Civil War. I actually, really closed the book with the first large-scale terrorist attacks in New York, which were carried out by Democrats. I close with the draft riots, which helped purge New York of Republicans. And one reason New York is such a Democrat stronghold is because of the draft riots drove out Republicans and black people. The black people came back, the Republicans not so much.
That's true. There's one element of this era, and certainly that intrigues me in terms of how it relates to our politics today, is Andrew Jackson, who is rightly considered, along with Jefferson. Democrats used to always have Jefferson-Jackson dinners. I don't think they call them that anymore. But Jackson really helps create the modern Democratic Party. And he's seen as a populist. And he certainly has a very, sort of bizarre economic. He doesn't really know much about economics, destroys the Bank of the United States and really destroys the American economy and everything that Hamilton had tried to build. Today, Trump is most often compared to Jackson. And indeed, this sort of the shift in the Republican Party in recent years under Trump to a more populist, version, less interested in what it's good for Wall Street, more interested in what's good for working Americans, which Democrats have abandoned. How do you see, Jackson and sort of the Jackson-Trump comparison now in light of everything you wrote about the history of the Democratic Party?
The conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton was in large part about economic centralization. And Jackson takes up that banner. He advances decentralization of the economy. I'm not sure that's something that Trump actually stands for, but the political dials definitely flip on that. And Republicans by the 20th century, certainly by the time the New Deal arrives, Republicans are actually big advocates of centralization post-Civil War. But by the time you have Wilson, by the time you have FDR, Republicans have actually gone more toward the libertarian side. They become the opponents of the New Deal, and this, really creates the Republican Party of today, or at least until not all that long before today.
Yeah, well, I think the parties have shifted. They certainly have exchanged identities on some of these issues, and certainly just as they exchanged identities on Israel in the last 60 years. I think your book is especially relevant because I believe that although there are many important issues, there's none, at least in my opinion, that is more important than the effort to roll back the woke tide of neo-Marxist critical race theory, intersectionality, DEI catechism, control of our education system, our culture, and now under Biden, the government. You see this virus of ideology as being a threat from the earliest years of America. But how, given the success of the left's long march through our institutions in recent decades, do we defeat it today?
That is also another reason why I wrote the book, because to a lot of people on the right these days, you just have to oppose whatever the woke are doing at this moment. You have to push back. But pushing back is not creating a better alternative. One of the important points that Abigail Adams, the wife of future President John Adams, makes in one of her letters about the left, she's discussing the French Revolution at the time, is that America is best positioned to fight that because we actually have an alternative. To so much of the world, the left just looks like a pretty good alternative to monarchy, to tyranny, whereas America had actually created something that was not a tyranny, and that was actually the most meaningful possible alternative to the left. And that's something we need to remember today. It's easy enough to push back, to denounce the left, to say this is terrible, defunding the police is insane, transgenderism is insane, but that only advances you so far. Being opposed to things is not actually enough to defeat it. You actually have to build a better alternative. And America's strength lay in the fact that it did build a better alternative. And some conservatives are neglecting the important work of building a better alternative. Because if we just criticize, if we just attack the left, yes, we are going to get some anti-establishment types on our side. But even if we win elections, we're not going to have anything to actually replace the left with.
Well, I think that's very important. Conservatives do need to advocate for the defense, not merely opposition to what the left wants, but the defense of Western civilization and of the foundation of the constitutional republic that is America, and that defends our liberty, and without which we will descend in sort of a neo-Marxist chaos, a woke tyranny. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on today. Please check out his book, Domestic Enemies. And you can find Daniel Greenfield at Front Page Magazine, JNS, and at his X account, which is at Sultan Knish. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.